9,260 feet. That is how far below the surface of the Earth the deepest shaft in the Keweenaw ever reached. Deeper than the tallest mountains are high. So deep that the rock itself grew warm to the touch, and the air came up thick and metallic, like breathing inside a struck bell. Most men never went past the 7th level. The ones who did rarely spoke about it. And there was one man, the last man to ride that cage all the way down before the company welded the gate shut, who came back up a different person than the one who went down. He told his story only once, to a nephew in a kitchen in Hancock, Michigan, near the end of his life. He said that past the final level, past the place that was later sealed with poured concrete and a steel plate stamped with a number nobody was allowed to copy, the copper stopped behaving like copper. And the walls, he said, had been cut before, cut clean, long before any of us. This is the story. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. Story of the last miner of the Keweenaw, and what the deepest level of the copper country was never meant to give up. To understand why any of this matters, you have to understand the place. The Keweenaw Peninsula juts out into Lake Superior like a bent finger, a spine of ancient volcanic rock in the far north of Michigan. For most of American history, nobody thought much about it. Cold, remote, buried under snow half the year. But underneath that frozen ground sat something that existed almost nowhere else on the planet. Native copper, pure copper. Not ore that had to be smelted and refined and coaxed out of stone, but metal, already metal, sitting in the rock in sheets and nuggets and masses you could cut with a saw. In most of the world, copper comes locked inside minerals, bonded to sulfur and oxygen, and it takes furnaces and chemistry to free it. In the Keweenaw, the earth handed it to you finished. Some of the masses they pulled out weighed more than a locomotive. One single piece of copper hauled from the Minnesota mine weighed over 500 tons. Men spent months just cutting it into chunks small enough to lift. By the middle of the 1800s, the world found out. And the rush that followed was bigger, in raw money, than the California gold rush that gets all the attention in the history books. Between the mines of the Keweenaw, more wealth came out of the ground than out of every gold field in the West combined. Towns appeared out of nothing. Calumet, Hancock, Houghton, Red Jacket. Opera houses in the wilderness. Streetcars running through snowbanks taller than a man. Immigrants poured in from Cornwall, Finland, Italy, Croatia, Slovenia, all chasing the same thing, all descending into the same dark. At its height, this frozen strip of land produced most of the copper in the entire United States, and a huge share of the copper on Earth. The wire that electrified American cities, the shell casings that armed 2 world wars, the plumbing and the telegraph, and the early electrical grid, an enormous amount of it started here, in the deep rock of a peninsula most Americans could not find on a map. So the mines went down, and down, and down. The Quincy mine, sitting on the hill above Hancock, earned a nickname that stuck for a reason. They called it Old Reliable, because it paid its investors a dividend almost every single year for decades, which almost no mine on Earth ever managed. Its shaft followed the copper-bearing rock down at an angle, and it kept following it, level after level, until the main shaft stretched over 1.9 miles in length, nearly 2 miles of hole. The Calumet and Hecla, the giant of them all, went even deeper in places. These were among the deepest mines that human beings had ever dug anywhere in the world at that time. To get a man to the bottom, they built cages and man cars, little rail cars that hauled the crews down the incline in the dark. The trip to the bottom could take the better part of an hour of riding down into the warm rock before your shift even started. And here is where the strangeness begins. Because the copper of the Keweenaw carries a mystery that has never been fully answered, one that historians and archaeologists still argue about, and one that the alternative history world has circled for decades. The mystery is this. The industrial mines of the 18 and 1900s were not the first people to dig here, not by a long shot. When the Cornish and Finnish miners arrived, they found that someone had been there before them, thousands of years before them. Scattered across the Keweenaw and out onto Isle Royale, the island in Lake Superior, are thousands upon thousands of ancient pits. Shallow workings, hammered out of the rock with stone tools, following the exact same copper veins the modern companies would later chase. Alongside them, researchers found the tools, stone hammers, tens of thousands of them, some weighing many pounds, shaped and grooved for handles, charcoal from ancient fires used to heat and crack the rock, wooden props preserved in the cold that carbon dating placed thousands of years into the past. The people who did this are usually called the Old Copper Culture, and the mainstream date for their work runs back as far as 6,000 or 7,000 years. That would make the copper mining of Lake Superior some of the oldest metalworking anywhere on the planet, older than a lot of what came out of the ancient Near East. And it is worth stopping on that word, oldest, because of what it does to the tidy line we were all taught in school. We were told that civilization crawls upward in a neat order. Stone, then copper, then bronze, then iron, each one arriving in its proper region at its proper time, spreading outward from a handful of cradles in the old world. But the copper of Lake Superior does not fit that line. It sits at the wrong end of the world, worked at a scale and a date that the schoolbook version struggles to place, by a people who left almost nothing behind except the holes they dug and the tools they dropped and the fires they lit. No cities that anyone has found. No temples. No writing. Just the pits, running for miles, and the hammers, counted in the tens of thousands, and a silence where an entire chapter of the human story ought to be. Out on Isle Royale, 40 miles from the mainland across some of the coldest and most dangerous water in North America, the ancient pits are thicker still. An island. You have to sit with that. Whoever these people were, they did not just wander the shore and pick up loose metal. They crossed open Lake Superior in numbers, again and again, to reach a specific island because they knew the copper was there, and they worked it hard enough to leave the ground pockmarked from end to end. That is not the behavior of scattered hunters stumbling on a curiosity. That is a supply operation. That is people who knew exactly what they were after and had the organization and the seamanship to go and get it, over and over, for a very long time. But the real puzzle, the one that keeps people up at night, is not that ancient people mined here. It is the arithmetic. When early surveyors and later researchers tried to estimate how much copper had been removed from these ancient pits, the numbers they came back with were staggering. Some estimates ran into the hundreds of millions of pounds. A few ran higher, into figures that sound almost impossible. More than 1 billion pounds of copper hammered out of the earth by hand, over thousands of years. And here is the question that has no clean answer. Where did all of it go? The archaeological record of the region, the burial mounds, the settlements, the trade goods, does not contain anything close to that amount of finished copper. A fraction of it turns up as tools and ornaments traded across the continent. But the rest? Hundreds of millions of pounds of pure metal, pulled out of the rock by a people we barely understand, and then gone. Vanished from the historical record as if it had been shipped somewhere and never came back. This is the crack in the official story. This is where the men who believe in a lost chapter of history plant their flag. Because if you are willing to entertain the idea that the timeline we were handed is incomplete, then the missing copper of Lake Superior is not a footnote, it is evidence. Evidence that someone, at some point, was running an operation on a scale that the textbook version of prehistory simply cannot explain. Someone with the organization to move a mountain of metal across an ocean or across time, and the reason to want it gone. Hold that thought, because now we go back down into the dark, and we meet the man who claimed to have touched the answer. His name, according to the family who kept his story, was Aldrich. Aldrich to his mother, though the crews just called him by his last name the way crews always did. He was born in the copper country in the early years of the 20th century, second generation, the son of a Cornish miner who had come across the water chasing the same seams. Aldrich went down into the Quincy for the first time at 17 years old, and he spent the next 40 years underground. By every account, He was not a dreamer. He was not a talker. He was the kind of man the company trusted with the jobs nobody else wanted, the deep repair work, the timber inspections in the levels that had gone quiet, the long, lonely trips to the bottom of the incline to check the pumps that fought back the water. The men who work the deepest and darkest parts of a mine are usually the least imaginative men in the crew, because imagination is a liability 9,000 feet down. Aldrich was exactly that kind of man, which is part of why the story is so hard to wave away. Steady men do not invent things. By the time we reach the part of Aldrich's life that matters, the great days of the copper country were already ending. The 2 world wars had drained the richest seams. The price of copper had turned against the deep, expensive Michigan mines, and the cheaper open-pit operations out west were eating the market alive. One by one, the great mines of the Keweenaw were slowing down, laying men off, and preparing to close for good. The Quincy itself was winding toward the end, and in a dying mine, strange things happen. Crews shrink, whole sections go dark. The company stops maintaining the levels it no longer works, and those levels fill slowly with water and silence. There were parts of the deep Quincy by then that no living man had walked in years. The story goes that in the final stretch, before the pumps were shut off for the last time and the lower workings were left to flood, the company sent a small crew down to recover what could still be recovered from the deepest levels. Equipment, rail, copper that had been cut but never hauled. It was salvage work, the kind of job you give to men you trust to go into a place that is technically abandoned and come back with something worth the trip. Aldrich was on that crew. He was, by his own telling, the most senior man on it, and he was the one who went furthest down. You need to understand what going that deep actually does to a person, because it matters for what comes next. The bottom of a mine like the Quincy is another country. The temperature climbs the further down you go, because the earth itself gets warmer with depth, and by the deepest levels the rock can be hot enough that men worked stripped to the waist and still poured sweat. The air goes heavy and close. Sound behaves wrong. A voice from 20 feet away can arrive muffled and flat, while a drip of water can ring out like a struck nail. Your lamp throws a small circle of yellow, and everything past it is a black, so total that your eyes invent shapes in it, and every experienced miner knows to distrust those shapes, because the dark is a liar, and the deep dark is the worst liar of all. Men who spent their lives down there learn to shut off that part of the mind entirely, to see only what the lamp truly showed and nothing the fear painted around it. That discipline is exactly what makes Aldrich's account so hard to set aside. He was trained for 40 years to not see things, and at the bottom of the Quincy, he said, he saw something anyway. Now here is where the family account and the official record start to diverge, and where you, watching this, get to decide what you believe. According to Aldrich, the deepest level of the mine, the true bottom, was not simply the end of the copper. He described riding the man-car down past the last work stope, past the point where the timbering stopped and the raw rock closed in, to a place where the incline levelled out into a drift that should not have existed. It was not on the maps he had seen, and it did not look like the rest of the mine. The Quincy, like every mine of its kind, was rough. Blasted rock, jagged and irregular, shored up with timber and following the drunken angle of the copper seam. But the drift Aldrich described at the very bottom was different. He said the walls were smooth, not smoothed by water, not polished by the slow drip of a million years, but cut, squared. He said that when he held his lamp up to them, the surfaces threw the light back at strange, even angles, as if the rock had been faced by something that knew exactly what a right angle was and cared about making one. And running along the walls, at regular intervals, were the marks. He never called them writing. He was careful about that. He called them cuts, grooves in sets, repeating, too regular to be natural and too deliberate to be the work of a pick. He said they went on down the drift as far as his lamp would reach. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. and then further into a dark his light could not fill, and the copper. This is the detail the nephew remembered most clearly, the one Aldrich came back to more than once. At the bottom, in that squared-off drift, the copper in the walls no longer sat in the rock the way it did everywhere else in the mine. Everywhere else, native copper is scattered, veined, threaded through the stone in shapes the earth made. Down there, Aldrich said, it ran in lines, straight lines, bands of pure copper set into the smooth wall at even spacing, like conduit, like wiring laid into a surface on purpose. He put his bare hand on one of them, and he said it was not cold the way the rest of the deep rock was cold. It was warm, and under his palm, faint, so faint he thought at first it was his own pulse, he felt it, a vibration, a hum in the metal, steady, coming from somewhere deeper than the level he stood on. He did not stay long. Whatever composure 40 years underground had built into him, that hum took it apart. He and the two men with him turned back, rode the man-car up, and reported that the salvage was not worth the risk, that the lower drift was unstable and flooding, and that the company should seal it and move on. That was the story he told above ground. The real reason he only ever gave to family, decades later. And Aldrich was not the only one. This is the thing the nephew stressed, years later. In the copper country, in the taverns and the church basements and the union halls, there had always been a kind of talk that stopped the moment an outsider walked in, not ghost stories exactly, something quieter and more careful than that. Old men who had worked the deepest levels would say, if they said anything at all, that the bottom of the mine was not like the top, that the company men who mapped the lower drifts sometimes came up pale and did not go down again, that there were levels the crews were pulled out of suddenly, with no explanation, and never sent back to. Every mining town has its tall tales, and most of them are nothing. But the pattern here was strange in a specific way. The stories did not brag. Tall tales brag. These stories did the opposite. They were told reluctantly, in low voices, by men who plainly wished they did not know what they knew, and who fell silent the instant you pressed for detail. Fear does not usually sound like that. Fear of a cave-in, fear of gas, fear of the water, those are loud fears, and miners talk about them freely, because talking about them is how you stay alive. This was a different register. This was the silence of men who had been told to be silent, and who had decided, on their own, that the telling was not worth whatever the price would be. And here is the part that lifts this out of a simple ghost story and into something colder. Because within a very short time, the company did seal it. But according to Aldrich, the company did not do it alone. He said that not long after the crew came up, men arrived who were not mining men. They came from out of state. They wore no company insignia, and they did not talk to the crews. They went down the incline with their own equipment, and they spent several days at the bottom, and when they came back up, the order came down that the deepest level was closed, permanently, effective immediately, and that no man was to speak of what was down there under threat of losing his pension, and worse. Aldrich said they poured concrete. He said they set a steel plate over the final drift, and that the plate carried a stamped number and a set of letters he took to be a federal marking, the kind you would see on government property, not company property. He was told, flatly, that the lowest level of the mine no longer existed, that it had never existed, that the maps would be corrected to show the mine ending one level higher than it truly did. And if you go looking today, that is roughly what the maps show. The official depth of the mine, the number in the records, the figure on the historical plaques. Aldrich spent the rest of his life insisting, quietly, only to people he trusted, that the real bottom was deeper than the number on the sign, that there was a level below the level, and that it had been closed not by the mining company, which was going bankrupt and had no money to pour concrete into a hole it was abandoning anyway, but by someone with the authority to classify a piece of the earth and the resources to do it fast. Think about that for a moment. A mining company on the edge of collapse does not spend money sealing worthless rock. It walks away. It shuts off the pumps and lets the water take everything, and it never looks back, because every dollar matters when you are dying. So who pays to weld the gate, pour the concrete, and set a federal plate over the deepest hole in the North American continent, and why? What is worth classifying at the bottom of a played-out copper mine in the far north of Michigan, in a place the world had already decided to forget? This is where the missing copper comes back. Remember the arithmetic. Hundreds of millions of pounds of pure metal, mined by hand thousands of years ago, and gone without a trace. The mainstream explanation is that it was traded away slowly, lost, scattered, and that our estimates of how much was mined are simply too high. That is the reasonable answer. That is the answer that lets you sleep. But there is another reading, and it is the one that Aldrich's story seems to point at like a compass needle. What if the ancient pits on the surface, the ones with the stone hammers and the charcoal fires, were never the main operation at all? What if they were the shallow edge of something that went far deeper? What if, long before the Cornish arrived, before the old copper culture we can name, someone was extracting copper from the Keweenaw on an industrial scale, from workings that went down into the warm rock, and doing it with methods that left smooth walls and squared drifts and lines of metal set into stone like circuitry? In the world of revisionist history, this is the shape of the theory. That the map we were handed, the neat progression from stone tools to bronze to iron to steam to electricity, is a story told after the fact to cover a gap. That there was an earlier world, technologically advanced in ways we do not recognize because we are looking for factories and finding ruins we mistake for nature. Some call that lost world by the name that has spread across 1,000 videos and forums, Tartaria. The idea, stripped down, is that a globe-spanning civilization existed before the one we know, that it built on a scale we now attribute to slow accident, that it was erased from the official record deliberately, and that the copper of Lake Superior was one of its resources. That the metal did not vanish. It was harvested, over an immense span of time, and moved, and that what Aldrich touched at the bottom of the Quincy was not a mine at all in the way he understood the word. It was a remnant, a piece of the old machinery, still humming, still warm, waiting in the dark under the ice. And once you start looking at the Keweenaw through that lens, other details begin to itch at you. The way the whole copper country seems to have been built at once, in a furious burst, and then abandoned almost as fast, leaving grand stone buildings standing empty in the snow like a set after the film has wrapped. The way the official story asks you to believe that ordinary immigrants with hand tools and black powder outdid an ancient people who supposedly mined 1 billion pounds of copper, and yet the ancient workings and the modern workings follow the exact same veins, as if the newcomers were simply reopening a door someone else had already cut. The way the deepest, oldest, strangest parts of the operation are precisely the parts that got sealed, flooded, and written out of the maps at the very end, right when the money to do any of that had supposedly run dry. None of it is proof. All of it is the kind of pattern that, once you notice it, you cannot unnotice. The revisionist reading does not ask you to throw out the immigrants and the dividends and the honest labour of the copper country. It asks you to consider that all of that was the second act, that the first act happened so long ago and was buried so thoroughly that we mistook its leftovers for the natural shape of the rock, and its deepest chambers for the bottom of a hole we dug ourselves. You do not have to believe that. I want to be honest with you here, because the people who tell these stories often are not. There is no photograph of the sealed drift. There is no leaked document with a stamped number. What there is a pattern, and the pattern is what unsettles people. The missing copper is real. The debate over the ancient estimates is real, and it has never been cleanly resolved. The extraordinary depth of the Keweenaw mines is real. The abrupt, well-documented death of the copper country, the sudden closures, the flooding of the deep levels, all of it is real, and all of it is in the record. And into that record steps the account of a steady, unimaginative man who spent 40 years underground and came up at the end of his career insisting on one thing. There was a level below the level, and it was sealed by people who do not seal things without a reason. The mine flooded, of course. Once the pumps went silent, the water that those pumps had held back for a century came up from below and filled the lower workings, level by level, drowning the deepest drifts under hundreds of feet of cold black water. Whatever is down there now, if anything is down there, sits under a column of flood that no ordinary person will ever move. the Quincy became a museum. Tourists ride a tram down the hillside and walk a short way into one of the upper levels, where the guides tell the ordinary history, the immigrants, the dividends, the 500-ton masses of copper, the honest and remarkable and true story of the copper country. They do not mention a federal plate at the bottom. Why would they? As far as the official record is concerned, the bottom is exactly where the number says it is, and not 1 foot deeper, and that flood is its own kind of seal, maybe the most effective one of all. A steel plate can be cut, concrete can be broken, a classified document can, eventually, leak, but hundreds of feet of freezing black water, standing in a shaft nearly 2 miles long, is a barrier that answers to nobody and negotiates with no one. To reach the bottom of the Quincy today, you would need to pump out a volume of water that took 100 years to accumulate, in a mine that no longer has power, in a region that has largely moved on. It will not happen. Not for a museum, not for a documentary, not for the curiosity of anyone alive now. Whoever wanted the deepest level closed could not have designed a better lock than the one the Earth quietly installed the moment the pumps went dark. The water came up from below, and it has been holding the door ever since, patient and total, and it is not going anywhere. Which means the only testimony we will ever have about what waits at the true bottom is the word of the handful of men who stood there before the water rose. And of those men, only one ever spoke. Aldrich died in the 1970s. The nephew who kept his account was a boy at the time of the kitchen conversation, and he did not repeat it for many years, partly out of respect, and partly because he did not want to be the man who told a story like that in a small town where everyone had worked the mines, and everyone knew that miners, near the end, sometimes carry the dark up with them. When he finally did speak, he added something his uncle had said at the very end of that conversation, something the old man delivered not as a warning, but as a fact, the way he might have told you the depth of a shaft or the grade of a seam. He said that the hum he felt in the copper had a rhythm to it, that it was not the random noise of water or machinery or a settling mountain. It rose and fell, slow, patient, even, like breathing, like something very large and very old, far below the last level any map admits to, taking its time, still down there, still running, waiting under a steel plate and a federal number, and 100 years of black water for the world to forget it was ever sealed at all. And maybe that is the real reason a bankrupt company found the money to close a hole in the ground. Not to keep men out, to keep something in. Or to keep the arithmetic buried, the simple, terrible sum that £1 billion of copper does not simply disappear, that metal on that scale goes somewhere, and that the somewhere might be exactly the direction Aldrich was pointing when he put his hand on a warm line of copper at the bottom of the deepest mine on the continent and felt the earth breathe back. The copper country froze over again after the mines died. The opera houses emptied, the streetcars stopped. The snow came down over Calumet and Hancock and Red Jacket the way it always had, and the great machines rusted, and the world moved on to easier metal in warmer places. But the peninsula is still there. The pits the ancient miners left are still there, scattered across the rock and the island, thousands of them, patiently asking a question nobody in the mainstream wants to answer out loud. Where did it all go? And 2 miles down, under the ice and the water and the poured concrete, sealed by hands that never gave their names, the last level of the Keweenaw keeps whatever answer it holds. The last miner touched it once. He came back up and lived a long, quiet life in the town where the mines had raised him, and told almost no one. And when he finally did, he did not ask anyone to believe him. He only asked them to remember that the number on the sign is not the bottom. The bottom is deeper. And whatever is down there was there long before we came, cutting the walls smooth, laying the copper in straight, bright lines, and waiting in the warm dark for the surface to grow quiet enough to listen.